Hello, everyone. It's 4 p.m. here in Brussels. Welcome to this online event on food supply disruptions in times of COVID-19. How African, Caribbean, and Pacific states can react. I hope that you are all doing very well and, of course, staying safe where you are. Thank you for joining us. By the way, I need to inform you that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available to the participants in a few days. I am Diego Borrero on behalf of the ICR facility. Welcome to all the participants and our panelists today. I'm glad to see that you come from numerous latitudes, numerous countries and regions. I see participants from Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, Mauritius, Zimbabwe, Solomon Islands, where, by the way, it's quite late, so thank you for staying up at night, as well as other countries around the globe. So thank you for joining us. Today, I am joined by two great panelists, two global experts, Anabel González and Edwini Kessie. Anabel González is one of the top global thinkers in the field of trade and global value chains, former Ministry of Foreign Trade, former World Bank Senior Director, and several other positions that she has been to. And she has also been recognized as one of the 28 women shaping global economic governance. So thank you, Anabel, for joining us. We also have Edwini Kessie. He's the director of the Agriculture and Commodities Division at the WTO. Dr. Kessie has been staff of the World Trade Organization for the past 25 years. So he has a unique view of global trade and food supply challenges. He also spent some years, 5 years, as chief trade advisor of the Pacific Island countries, and he was based in Vanuatu. So thank you very much, Edwini and Anabel, for joining us today. Before starting, for those that are not yet familiar with ICR, with the ICR facility, the ICR facility is co-funded by the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, under the 11th European Development Fund, together with the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the British Council. We are 4 implementing agencies of the ICR facility: GIZ, British Council, Expertise France, and SNV. The objective of ICR, the ICR facility, is to contribute to improve the investment climate in ACP countries. To do this, the ICR facility responds to requests through technical assistance. These requests can come from any of the 79 ACP countries, and we implement these interventions at 3 levels. First, business environment reform. Second, business environment sustainability. And third, PPD, public-private dialogue. The first area is about supporting the enhancement of the business environment through the different and the various policy areas, functional areas of the business environment. The second one is about making the business environment more sustainable, and by sustainable we mean socially sustainable and environmentally sustainable. And third, of course, we support PPD, public-private dialogue, which is a key instrument to inform and to implement these policies and these reforms. So last but not least, we encourage you to participate actively from where you are by posting your questions and comments in the field that you have there on your screen for posting your questions. We look forward to those questions and comments. Also, please stay tuned until the end of this presentation, because at the end we are going to explain also how to apply for those one-on-one sessions with the expert Anabel González. So thank you very much, Anabel and Edwini. Anabel, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Diego, for the invitation. Thanks to you and to the ICR facility. I am delighted to be here with the participants, and of course with my former colleague, Edwini Kessie, at the WTO. First, let me say that I hope that all of you are staying safe and well in these challenging times. And we are going to discuss today precisely one topic that is critical in the context of the pandemic. And we will actually focus on 5 parts of 5 points in this agenda. And the first one is, will COVID-19 lead to a global food crisis? And here, I just checked this morning before I came into this webinar. I just checked on the number of people infected with the disease worldwide and with the virus, and there are 26.1 million cases as of today, with 864,000 deaths. So there is no question that the COVID-19 is a global health crisis. And clearly, the global health crisis and the containment measures that have been adopted have led to a global recession. And this global recession is actually the worst that the world has seen since World War II, and it's actually the 4th worth in history. The IMF is expecting that global output will contract 5.2%. The WTO estimates that world merchandise trade could be reduced between 13 and 32%, and UNCTAD estimates that global FDI flows will decrease by between 30 and 40%. Now, of course, the worst part relates to the impact of all of this on poverty. It is estimated that poverty will increase by between 70 and 100 million people. And this is equivalent to, to have an idea, this is equivalent, like, if we have 100 million people falling into extreme poverty this year, it would be equivalent as if the whole of Kenya plus the whole of Uganda would fall into poverty. So this is something quite serious. And we know that there are regions that are particularly impacted, including the Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Now, if we look into, so what would be the impact on hunger? We basically know that COVID-19 is driving up hunger in countries that were already experiencing high levels of food insecurity prior to the disease outbreak. And these are some of the countries that, maybe we can talk about food security hotspots. This includes, of course, fragile and conflict-affected states, countries affected by multiple events and pests, the poor and vulnerable, and countries with significant currency depreciation driving up the cost of food imports. Think, for instance, about the currency depreciation in Nigeria, but also countries that are seeing other commodity prices collapse, reducing their capacity to import food. And we will talk a little bit more about this. Now, one important question is, well, how is it that COVID-19 affects the food system? And let me first say that the global food system is basically comprised by 517 million farmers all over the world, that feed basically 7.7 billion consumers. But this is not seamless. Food does not move seamless from producers to consumers. There are information asymmetries, there is market power, and there are high transaction costs, a point that we will come back to in the course of our presentation. Now, when we think about this a little bit more in detail, we can see that COVID-19 basically affects the entire food system. It exerts a symmetric but not synchronous shock on global and national food systems. Basically, it impacts both the food supply and demand channels, but they may be impacted at different points in time. It also affects all elements of the food system, from primary supply to processing to trade, as well as national and international logistics systems to intermediate and final demand. It also affects factor markets, namely labor and capital, and intermediate inputs of production. The channels of transmission into food and agricultural demand include numerous macroeconomic factors, most notably movements in exchange rates, but also energy markets and credit markets. And most importantly, the food system is impacted by the expected surge in unemployment and the contraction overall of economic activity. So this is very important because this sets the basis of how we think about policy responses to the disruptions in the food system. But before going there, I would like us to look a little bit more into how is it that these shocks are transmitted to different countries. And this is important because not all countries are impacted in the same way, as you can imagine. When we look at the exposure to COVID-19 supply shocks across regions, we see that developed countries are more exposed to supply side disruptions, given their highly integrated and capital-intensive agricultural systems. So we have that they may face possible disruptions in the availability of intermediate inputs and fixed capital items derived from disruptions either in the local or international transportation systems, clogged ports and roads, and delays in customs clearances. And we have seen this in a number of places. But also, we see that they have greater exposure to disruptions in credit markets because they're more connected to credit markets. Having said this, however, lower energy prices can also balance possible increases in interest rates, and then they may function as automatic stabilizers. So in the case of developing regions, normally they appear to be less susceptible to supply shocks, reflecting their limited reliance on intermediate inputs and fixed capital. However, as most farming systems in many developing countries are highly labor intensive, if there's a widespread outbreak of COVID-19, this would expose their agricultural production to possible labor shortages. And this is especially the case when this refers to crops that are labor intensive. For example, fruits, vegetables, dairy production, meat processing. For example, and this applies, for instance, in the case of the United States, we have seen the labor disruptions in the meat packaging industry that led to shortages in meat supply during specific outbreaks of COVID-19 in specific plants. Now, if we move now to look at the exposure to COVID-19 demand shocks across regions, we see that the demand shocks are mostly concentrated in developing countries. If you look at the figure here, we see, for instance, that in sub-Saharan Africa, we can expect greater exposure to demand shocks. And the reason for this is because consumers have limited savings, and they also have limited access to public safety nets. They tend to rely more, or they tend to be more exposed through their reliance on food inputs. And again, we will come a little bit more to this. And last but not least, we also know that poor consumers normally spend a larger share of their overall expenditures on food. So from the perspective of demand, this means that many poor consumers in the developing nations are going to be more impacted. Now, moving forward and exploring a little bit how is it that trade works as a transmission channel, from COVID impacting the food supply systems, we basically see that here we have in this figure the top 30 export-dependent countries for food and agriculture in the period 2016 to 2018. And we can see that many low-income countries depend on agriculture, often a few commodities, for much of their export earnings. So these countries are particularly exposed to shocks that may emanate from global agricultural markets. So, we have, for example, Guinea-Bissau, Kiribati, and Malawi receiving more than 70% of their export earnings from agriculture. So, of course, any disruption in markets is going to impact these countries quite significantly. It's also important to note that many of these countries can also be exposed to supply side risks. For instance, temporary shortages in labor supply, and also labor-intensive goods, as I was mentioning before, may also be highly perishable or vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. And we'll talk later on a little bit about the example of what's going on, for instance, in Kenya, or what happened during March, April, May this year in Kenya with exports of flowers. But also, please take a look at the graph that reflects the sharp fall in commodity prices impacting ACP countries, which it's basically meant to say that some of these countries will be deprived from export earnings, which are quite important, of course, to import food. Now, looking at it from the perspective of imports, we have in this graph the top 30 import-dependent countries or regions for food and agriculture. And here we can see that lower international commodity prices induced by a decline in the overall economic activity would benefit net agricultural importers. From the perspective of exporters, the low prices is not good news. From the perspective of the net importers, it could be good news. And these may help ease some of the possible contractions in purchasing power that may arise from internal economic recessions, acting a bit as an automatic stabilizer for food security in low-income food importing developing countries, and allowing them basically to import larger quantities of food at lower prices. Now, high import dependency, however, could also expose countries to disruptions in international supply chains, lack of labor and functioning transportation capacity, clogged ports and storage facilities, and we have seen these across several countries in the world, and limited discharge capabilities. Now, one important point also to mention is that the virtual standstill in passenger flights that are used to transport food has reduced the availability of nutritious food, certain fruits and vegetables. And in the case of the Caribbean and Pacific Islands, they could be highly exposed and are actually being highly exposed to disruptions in imports, further aggravated, of course, by the reduced export earnings from lack of tourism and reduced remittances. So in the graph, in the second graph, we see the decline in the number of daily inbound flights to the Caribbean, which shows again how is it that trade is acting as a channel of transmission of the negative impacts of COVID-19 into the domestic populations in this case of the Caribbean, but the same applies, of course, to the Pacific Islands. Also, please note that lack of income and employment from a contraction in the tourism industry is likely to outweigh the benefits from lower input costs in these countries. We know that, of course, a number of ACP countries are highly dependent on tourism, and we know that globally the tourism industry, the hospitality industry more broadly, has been devastated. So export earnings for these countries will be quite limited. So even if prices go down, even as prices are going down, as I was mentioning, they will not necessarily offset the negative impact on the tourism industry, and for some countries as well on remittances. Now, here we have, we're looking at how is it that agricultural exports and imports, what has been the performance in the first month of this year, and this is information from the WTO. And you can see that we have basically the comparison between this year and next year for the first quarter, for March and for April. And we see that from the export side, what we are seeing is that a number of countries in Latin America, both in Central America, but in particular in South America, are seeing huge increases in exports. So Brazil, for example, is of course a very important exporter, and it's basically serving a number of countries in the world, for instance, including in Africa. So anything that happens in Brazil, which is one of the countries that has the highest number of COVID-19, for example, could eventually impact the food supply chain. Hasn't happened so far in the sense that they have actually raised their exports, but that, if not contained, is something that could import exports in the future. Now, if we look at it from the perspective of imports, we basically see that imports have dropped, for instance, you see April, imports have dropped quite significantly in Europe and North America, because these were the regions, aside from China, these were the regions that were highly impacted at the beginning of the pandemic waves. And this in turn, we will look into this in turn has impacted exports from a number of African countries. If we look at Africa, for example, we see that imports have mostly risen in the first quarter of this year. Likewise for the Middle East, for example. Now, this is a very important slide. Because as you know, as of end April this year, there were some 20 governments, and Edwini may have some more precise information, but there were some 20 countries that had imposed some kind of export restriction, export bans, curbs, export prohibitions. For example, Russia on wheat and other products, Kazakhstan as well, Ukraine, Vietnam, for instance, on rice, likewise Cambodia, India, Egypt on fresh products. And I have to say that export restrictions have, of course, dire consequences for importing countries. They restrict availability of food, they tend to drive prices up, and they are also detrimental to food exporters themselves, because they disincentivize investment, they disincentivize production, and also very importantly, as there's no one country that can produce everything that is needed, they also invite retaliation from other countries. So while it sometimes is a natural reaction for governments to try to close their borders to keep food supplies within countries, it's actually a very bad idea for the world as a whole. Now, the good news is that most of those countries that have imposed export restrictions have either let those restrictions lapse, some of them were temporary, for example, or they have not been renewed, or they have been actually removed. Having said that, we see here in the map that there are a number of countries that are impacted or have been impacted by these food restrictions. Now, one important point to mention is that this is not nearly as bad today as it was during the food crisis of 2008 and 2009. At that time, some 15% of world calories were covered by export restrictions. And this actually led, there are some very important studies, for instance, by Will Martin that showed, and Kim Anderson, that showed that the prices of wheat went up by 45% as a result of these measures. And likewise, the price of rice also increased by 30%, so with very detrimental impacts on food security. This is not the situation today. Today, and this is when, in April, when this was at its worst, the world calories that were covered by the restrictions amounted to about 4% of this world calories. So one key message that I want to leave with you is that freedom to trade is important to food and nutrition security in regular times, and it is even more important in the context of global hardship like the COVID-19. And this I think is something that I will come back to when discussing policy recommendations, because really we need to make sure that food can be moved to where it is produced, to where it is needed. Now, another important question is, well, can current global food supplies satisfy food needs? That is, one reason why the response of many countries during the financial crisis or the global food crisis of 2008, 2009 was to restrict exports is because there were not enough food supplies. But the situation is very different today. Let's look, for instance, at this FAO food price index, which stood at 94.2% in July, or the FAO food commodity price indices, which averaged 96.9% in July as well. And basically, what FAO is telling us that barring major disruptions in supply, in the supply chain, the trend of generally lower food prices is projected to prevail, which could attenuate the global security concerns, at least as compared to the food crisis of 2008 and 2009. Now, this does not mean that stable or rather lower food prices can prevent local, national, or even international disruptions in supply chain, nor they can ensure that prices in local currencies will not see increases. And this is an important point, as we were mentioning, because the movement in exchange rates can impact, of course, the price of food in local markets. And this is actually what we're seeing as a number of currencies depreciate vis-a-vis the US dollar, for example. Now, when, I will not go into detail into, the outlook for the different global markets, but overall to say that stocks are at a high level and that harvests are looking relatively good in most food markets. So you can then read a little bit more about each one of them. But markets like wheat and rice are projected to remain relatively stable, or sugar. So this is something that's important, because it goes to the question, is there going to be enough food to satisfy food needs? And the answer seems to be that yes, there will be enough food at the global level, and also that prices will remain either stable or actually decrease. So, here it's important. This is the outlook for a number of commodities. And we see that the lower economic growth path in the COVID-19 scenario, basically this is based on OECD and FAO agricultural outlook for 2020 to 2029. And they find that a lower economic growth path scenario leads to a reduced growth in demand for agricultural commodities. Lowering economic growth and lower economic growth reduces food demand, and lower commodity prices support demand. So the outcome differs, of course, among agricultural products. We have the consumption of staple foods like roots and tubers, rice and wheat is less affected by the COVID-19 scenario, whereas the impact of the food consumption of vegetable oil and animal products is considerably higher. We also know that the outcome differs across countries, and that the impact on least developed countries is considerably higher than the impact on the world average. And for certain combinations of products and countries, the food consumption even increases as lower prices outweigh lower economic growth. Now, overall, the medium-term impact on average food consumption is not projected to be particularly strong. But LDCs, of course, appear more at risk, and the impact will be even larger for the poorer segments of the population. So finally, this is the outlook for global food markets, and in particular, we see here that total agricultural trade is expected to contract more markedly in the Great Lockdown as compared to, for instance, the global food crisis of 2008 and 2009. Precisely because of the reasons that we were mentioning. But note that in the case of food, which is not necessarily the case in other sectors, the recovery is estimated now to take more like a V shape. But of course, this will depend also, on the one hand, on the trajectory of the virus, and on the other hand, on the policy responses from governments. So, in summing up, I think it's important to say that COVID-19 has imposed shocks on all segments of the food supply chains, including farm production, food processing, transport and logistics, and final demand, including in ACP countries. But not all sectors or products have been affected equally, and different products have experienced different disruptions at different stages of the supply chain. Now, the other important point to make is that despite these sporadic export restrictions, and hoping that they will not get worse, the current supply-demand situation is very different from the situation at the start of the 2007-2008 global food crisis. And we have mentioned some of the reasons. First, global food production prospects are positive. Stocks are high. International food prices are low. Trade is broader based with more importing and exporting countries. The cost of bulk transportation are depressed. First, fertilizer and input prices have remained stable, at least so far. Energy prices have collapsed. When we had the food crisis in 2007, 2008, remember that at that time energy prices had gone to the roof, and then what happened is that food was being channeled into energy production. So that imposed another stress on food systems globally and at the national level as well. Competition, and this is precisely what I was mentioning, competition from biofuels has virtually ceased. Nowadays, nobody is talking about biofuels because energy prices are extremely low. Policymakers, and this is something very important, policymakers learned from the previous crisis, and they are more experienced in dealing with global crises, and they're better informed and prepared. Actually, as a result of that crisis, there was put in place an agricultural market information system where there are a number of institutions, I believe some 10 institutions that participate to basically monitor the food prices of 4 key commodities. And this is one important source, and we'll come back to this later on, one important source of information for countries. We have seen that food demand is likely to stagnate or even decline given the expected contraction of global GDP, and the demand in the non-food sector is likely to be capped in the sharply in view of the sharply lower prices for fossil fuels. So, at the global level, again, at the global level, this does not mean at the national level, regional level, but at the global level, there is enough food supply. Now, there could be possible bottlenecks, but even in from what we have seen so far, these factors do not support an outlook of a looming global food security crisis arising from supply shortages. Notice that I refer to a global food security crisis. There are and there will continue to be crises at local level, and we mention it in conflict and afflicted states, for poor people in some countries, for countries that see their currency devalued significantly. But at the global level, we're not seeing a global food security crisis. Now, for this to remain the case, trade needs to remain open and frictionless, free from restrictions, with speedy clearances at customs, borders, and ports. In particular, if we have export restrictions, then the picture may change completely. Now, COVID-19, so it's not a crisis of food, but this is very important. COVID-19 will exert a shock on final food demand by lowering overall purchasing power, especially for the increasing number of unemployed people. I was looking yesterday at some numbers from the International Labour Organization, and the ILO estimates that there are an equivalent of 555 million jobs that have been lost in Q1 and Q2 of this year as a result of the pandemic. So all of these unemployed people will not have the resources, will not necessarily have the resources to buy the food. And this is where the big problem comes in the context of COVID-19. Now, the extent and depth of the impact on food demand will depend on the depth and the length of the macroeconomic shock, the availability of savings, and access to credit and safety net mechanisms. Now, also, given the size of the challenges and enormous uncertainties associated with it, the international community must remain vigilant and ready to act if and when necessary. Again, this is a moving picture. And it is important to be vigilant and monitor, and as I was mentioning, come in and act in case it is required. Now, I want to do a little bit of a deep dive to the situation on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa, because we've been talking mostly at the global level. And here's, to start with, let me present to you a snapshot on Africa's trade in agricultural products. We see basically that Africa exports between 35 and 40 billion worth of agricultural products. It imports between 45 and 50 billion of agricultural products and 6 billion in agricultural inputs. Notice that the first part is, of course, very relevant for food security, but the second part is critical for production. And it's also relevant to say that about $8 billion in food and agricultural products flow through regional trade. That is, regional trade is critical for food security, or very important for food security in Africa. Now, what is it that is being reported from the ground? Well, agricultural products are flowing, although there are localized market and logistical bottlenecks. Markets have largely remained open as countries have declared, most countries have declared agriculture as essential services. Supply disruptions have been isolated. However, the logistics in many countries are under pressure, and costs are being driven up by the travel restrictions, by border checks, by curfews, by delays, etc. And also changing regulations have also compromised trade flows. We have seen in East Africa, for example, that regulations, for instance, relating to truck drivers have changed. So the rules are not clear, and this has resulted in delays or border closing. So, you know, the uncoordinated response to the pandemic has caused some bottlenecks in some places. We've also seen that agricultural pricing has faced some localized pricing spikes after the start of the lockdown in many countries, with some indications that this may be stabilizing. I was mentioning in East Africa, for instance, price hikes caused by panic buying and hoarding, which were more acute in the Great Lakes region, partly due to the restrictions of the Ugandan border preventing the easy trade of agricultural products. Now, increases, however, have appeared to have been opportunistic rather than compelled by market forces. That is, these were sort of natural reactions in the moment rather than more structural forces going on here. In the case of agricultural exports, we have seen that they have faced demand disruptions and some supply chain issues. Products like flowers, vegetables, nuts, coffee, and cocoa are affected by the slow demand in export markets in the US, in Europe. And also, a point that I was mentioning before, that the suspension of international passenger flights has resulted in reduction in available cargo capacity and increase in cargo costs. And here, I'd like to look at a little bit, you know, if we look at the graph here, we basically find that approximately 80% of Africa's agricultural exports go to regions that have been severely affected by COVID-19. So this has basically impacted demand for a number of African products. For example, for fruits, vegetables, and nuts from South Africa or North Africa, markets are Europe, Middle East, North Africa. For instance, for cocoa, for Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire, the market is Western Europe. And so basically here we see for all the different commodities, we see that most of them go to markets that suffer the first wave of the pandemic. And we don't know whether there will be other waves or not, but as of now, we can say that African exports have been impacted. And I want to make, many of you may be familiar with this example, but I find this, you know, a very clear sort of example of what is really happening on the ground. And this is the case of Kenya flour exports. It has happened to Ethiopia as well, for example. And basically, you know, when the pandemic came and we had the lockdowns in Europe, shoppers focused first on, you know, just purchasing essential items. And of course, the lockdown impacted all types of ceremonies. You know, weddings were canceled, funerals were severely restricted, all types of parties were basically disincentivized by the lockdowns. So the demand for flowers crashed in the second quarter. So Kenya, which you may know accounted for 85% of sub-Saharan Africa flower exports in 2018, valued at $600 million US, has been severely affected as most of its exports were canceled in late March. You may have seen, for instance, pictures of you know, flowers just lying on the road with farmers just throwing their flowers away because they could not export them, you know, to London or to Paris or to some other city in Europe. On the supply side, logistical delays can lead to losses as well because flowers, as we know, cannot sit for long in storage. The Kenyan Flower Council estimates that its 2020 revenue from flowers could be cut by half, and as much as 400 to 600 million in revenue may be lost, affecting between 70,000 and 100,000 direct jobs. Temporary workers have also been impacted. 30,000 of them have been let go, while the industry's 40,000 permanent workers have been furloughed. So while and this was a catastrophic situation in March, April this year, while the industry was showing some signs of recovery in May, prices are depressed and cargo capacity continues to be a challenge. So this is, the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown measures on the ground in a very specific sector in Kenya. But this can be replicated. It's actually being replicated across other ACP countries across the world more broadly in other sectors as well. Now, we basically see that there may be three potential shocks in the region in sub-Saharan Africa. First, the demand side shock. We know the loss of jobs and livelihoods and food price volatility that could amplify the crisis through increased food insecurity. And we know that there are more than 150 million Africans that could lose all or part of their livelihoods. We also have the trade shock. We have talked about this, the drop in export earnings and the increased price volatility for export crops, and also the production shock that may disrupt upcoming planting seasons and impede an effective response to the East African locust outbreak. Now, the situation on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa is more complicated because of pre-existing trade frictions. And we know that there are pervasive non-tariff barriers and high trade costs that increase trade frictions and limit the potential role of intra and extra-regional agricultural trade, especially for small traders. And we know what these barriers are: high transport costs, opaque and unpredictable trade policies, cross-border obstacles such as inconsistent, heavy-handed implementation of import controls at the border, inefficient distribution services. And we know that the small traders that are so prevalent in Africa, and in particular the small women traders, are particularly impacted by this high cost of exporting and importing. And we also know that these are further exacerbated by the high barriers to trade in services. So one important aspect of reducing, making trade flow more smoothly or seamlessly in Africa is reducing trade costs. So this is a little bit a picture of the situation as it stands today. As I was mentioning, it's still in flux, but this is where we are. So what is it that countries can do to minimize and manage negative impact, in particular in ACP countries? And here I think there are some important recommendations to act now to lessen potential shocks. Expand near real-time food security monitoring systems. This is very critical. Monitor food trade, food supplies, food prices to manage food availability, accessibility, and affordability. And many countries have also set up food security or agricultural response units in the face of COVID-19, basically as centralized strategic and planning hubs ready to intervene in case that the shortages or price hikes come about. Keep moving food from farm to fork in a safe and affordable way. And it's important to treat food as an essential services, providing all the protection, of course, to workers, open green channels for food, for trade and agricultural imports to ensure that supply chains are kept open and functional. And also, very important is to ensure access and availability of key agricultural imports by keeping import supply chains functioning. It's also relevant to prevent critical humanitarian food livelihood and critical humanitarian livelihood and nutrition assistance to vulnerable groups, and to position food in food crisis countries to reinforce and scale up the social protection systems. So this is more like the immediate reaction. It's also important to do no harm, and this is as important as to act expeditiously. Do no harm is, get the diagnostic right. There are local issues, but not global supply behind the empty shelves at this time. So no need, to restrict trade, no need to have export bans in place. And it's, on the contrary, very important to keep trade open at the global level to stabilize world food markets. We have talked about this before. And last but not least, and I'll come to this as well in the next section, regional cooperation is also critical, as food security in several countries depends a great deal on intra-regional trade. And here, the potential of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is very significant. conclusion of the negotiations and implementation, which is now being postponed to January next year, could help keep food flowing in the region. Now, thinking more about the medium term and how to improve the functioning of food systems in the medium term, there are also a number of recommendations. First, do more and lay the foundations to build back better. How do we do this? First, promoting cooperation among customs and border control authorities to implement a simplified, expedited emergency procedure for clearing critical goods with a specific focus on food. Consider lifting tariffs. A number of countries have already done this on a temporary basis, but it could also be considered on a permanent basis on goods critical for food security, such as basic staples and seeds, fertilizers, and other inputs. Implement expedited licensing and certification processes related to sanitary and phytosanitary standards to avoid that legitimate health and safety standards unnecessarily hinder trade. Use non-intrusive control mechanisms to fast-track the release of goods with specific channels, in particular for perishable and cold-sensitive items. Collaborate with reliable certified importers, such as, for instance, the authorized economic operators and companies that frequently trade essential goods to facilitate imports and export processes. Maintain lines of communication with the public and private players in the logistics chain to see what's happening there, to communicate new processes and adjust these new processes. Lay the foundations of coordination border management systems to emerge from the crisis with a more efficient trade infrastructure. Eliminate, and I must say also that progress that in some parts of Africa, for example, in this area have been quite important, for instance, in the East Africa region. Eliminate FDI restrictions, foreign direct investment restrictions in critical export-related services, for instance, in processing, in transport, in logistics. Improve competition policy institutions and rules, for example, to tackle transport cartels, which are prevalent certainly in all of Africa, in the Caribbean, and that raise the cost of food. And last but not least, and I'll talk in a moment about this, implement a trade-enabling e-commerce framework, because e-commerce can bring together producers and consumers in a more expedited way. It's also important to strengthen global trade cooperation. A well-functioning global trading system can ensure global food security and allow producers in exporting countries to thrive. In the context of the WTO, and I imagine that Edwini will talk to this, 49 WTO members that represent 63% of global exports of food and 55% of imports committed to not disrupting the global food supply chain, not imposing export restrictions, ensuring that the response to COVID-19 remains targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary, and exercise restraint in establishing domestic food stocks of agricultural products that are traditionally exported. And they've also been notifying the WTO of the measures that they have taken. But it's also important that WTO agricultural negotiations pick up steam to achieve a more open, predictable, and transparent agricultural trading system that supports food security. I also want to make the case that the case for implementing effectively the trade facilitation agreement, because this could help streamline customs and border management and reduce those infamous trade costs that I was mentioning before. Regional cooperation is also very important, and I was mentioning the relevance or the potential of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area to benefit the poor. Here, early liberalization of products that could provide a natural ladder for diversification in Africa, including agricultural products, is important. Fostering regional value chains, opening and putting in place regulatory frameworks for services industries that are critical for competitiveness, and also in the second phase of the negotiations, establishing the rules on investment, competition policy, and intellectual property as foreseen. It's also important to limit exclusions of food products, because if countries continue to have high tariffs on food products, then the regional mechanism will not work as effectively to transmit food from places where it's produced to places where it's needed. And finally, it's very important that the high cost of getting foods to and from borders or ports are tackled. And this is particularly important for the informal cross-border traders, many of which are women. And this is why trade facilitation, again, at the regional level is a very important agenda. Let me also just say a word on leveraging the potential of digital platforms to improve food systems. And we know that this digital technologies and networks can accelerate food system transformation by overcoming long-standing market and policy failures. And we know that for this to happen, and there's of course a great story, and some of you may know it, certainly those of you in East Africa, certainly in Kenya, of Twiga Foods, for example, that has done a wonderful job in, basically utilizing mobile-based B2B digital commerce platform to match small-scale supply and demand for fruits and vegetables. Last time I was in a panel with the CEO of Twiga, I think he was mentioning that he connects 35,000 suppliers with consumers, which is quite, it shows how powerful these digital platforms can be in again, trying to reduce or mitigate the frictions in trade. Now, for this, government policies are important to deconcentrate markets and supply chains, to decentralize traceability, and traceability can become also a very important element here for having access to safer, more sustainable food. We have a great example, for instance, and we can talk later about that, of the livestock information system in Uruguay, for example, that has been very successful. And then finally, of course, disseminate open data. So here are links to a few resources that you may find useful in planning on how to address food supply restrictions in the era of COVID-19. A number of very useful FAO sites, World Bank as well. This agricultural market information system market database that I was making reference to, the COVID-19 food trade policy tracker from IFPRI, the WTO, of course, the Committee on Agriculture, and Edwini, of course, knows this very well. The Standards and Trade Development Facility, another facility housed at the WTO, and the WTO also has been putting in place some very interesting trade dialogues on food, which I highly recommend. So these are some of the sites that if you're interested, you should go and take a look. And let me just conclude with 4 sort of, again, 30,000 feet reflections. The first one being that the world is doing better now compared to the 2007-2008 global food price crisis. But the pandemic has put a heavy burden on global food security and could plunge about 265 million people, up from the 135 million people already, into acute hunger by the end of 2020, unless swift action is taken. Governments need to act now to lessen the potential shocks and lay the foundations to build better, with some of the recommendations mentioned before. And global and regional trade cooperation can play a key role in supporting food security by enabling food to move from surplus regions to places where the food is needed. So with this, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. And I look forward to listen to Edwini, of course, and also to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Do I wait for Diego, or can I start?
Yes, please go ahead, Edwini.
Okay, thank you, Diego.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the ICR for organizing this timely webinar and for extending an invitation to the WTO. And I would also like to thank Anabel for her very detailed presentation on this timely topic. Let me start with some general comments before looking more specifically at the question of policy measures that have been put in place to ensure sustainable food supply. According to most observers and international experts, and as was underscored by Anabel, the world is not in a situation of food insecurity generated by insufficient food supply, as illustrated, for example, by the evolution of food prices since the beginning of the crisis. It is true that in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, there were supply disruptions for some products, which were caused principally by panic buying and the effect of emergency lockdowns on food production, processing, and transportation. However, this proved to be short-lived as food supply was considered as essential by several governments, putting it on par with drugs and other health-related services, and efforts were made, including through dedicated rules to ensure that supply chains were kept open and functional. The main anticipated cause of food insecurity due to COVID-19 in the coming months is rather a weakening of food demand. And I think this point was underlined by Anabel as a result of the economic contraction in many countries, accompanied by the widespread loss of disposable income. While price declines may compensate for reduced incomes, it could be dire for some consumers, especially the most vulnerable, in the absence of savings or public safety net mechanisms. The recent OECD FAO outlook posits that supply growth is expected to outpace demand growth in the next 10 years, which will cause agricultural prices to decline. Thus, the general assessment is that there are currently no major supply-related identified causes that will transform the health crisis into a food crisis. It can be broadly surmised that trade in food and agricultural products has been more resilient than trade in industrial products. Trade in agricultural products expressed in value terms increased in March and April 2020 by 3.3% and 0.6% respectively, compared to the same period a year before. The total export of many food products increased, while there was a steep drop in the exports of non-edible agricultural products. The situation, of course, differed for countries as well as for regions. A note of caution, though, this overall positive conclusion is conditional upon maintaining the current productive capacity of the agricultural sector. One of the main risks perceived by several governments with the persistence of COVID is the fragility of some agricultural producers, particularly small and low-income producers who are most susceptible to lower prices and demand. Higher production costs could also impact on their financial and economic viability. Bankruptcies and cessation of activities can have important ramifications for food production in the coming months. Thus, the risks of disruptions to food supply chains from production to processing and transportation remain and must be monitored carefully and addressed sufficiently. The ACP group of countries represent a large and diverse group, ranging from big countries to small islands with very different climatic and economic conditions, with some farmers engaged mainly in subsistence farming and others into cash crop farming. It should be noted that some ACP countries face other challenges and threats as well, such as the desert locust outbreak in East Africa, which could further disrupt food supplies. Consequently, there is no one-size-fits-all approach in addressing the question of food supply, and every situation has to be assessed carefully on a case-by-case basis. Despite these differences, there are also some common factors, such as the importance of the agriculture and the economy of ACP countries, and the fact that almost all ACP countries are developing countries with limited financial resources, when compared with developed or more advanced developing countries. Notwithstanding these differences, some lessons can be drawn from the experience acquired in recent months on what needs to be done to minimize the risk to disruptions to food supply. Policy measures can be looked at from different perspectives. First, we could have short-term measures with immediate effects, in particular to address emergency situations, versus long-term measures that need more time to be implemented and are aimed at ensuring the resilience of the overall food system. Second, ACP countries' food supply depends not only on policy measures implemented by them, but also those of other members of the WTO, so to speak, which actually underscores the interdependence of countries. So it is very important for there to be an open trading system, because so as to be able to move food from the surplus areas to the deficit areas. The key point that I'm just making is that trade has a crucial role to play in guaranteeing global food security, both in the short term and in the long term, by moving products from surplus to deficit areas. Consequently, a well-functioning, resilient, open, predictable, transparent, inclusive, and a less distorted international trading system, agricultural trading system, constitutes a central element in guaranteeing food security, both at a global level and at an individual country level, in particularly for the net food importing developing countries. Now, let me comment more specifically on the three aspects which were covered by Anabel in her presentation. What signals to look for to assess food supply chain disruptions? From a WTO perspective, enhanced transparency is very important. Initially, when there was panic buying and countries imposed export restrictions, it was mainly because of incomplete information. Many countries had not notified, but as information got out there that there isn't shortage of food, a lot of countries began to unwind the restrictive measures that they have put in place. So it's very, very important for there to be information. If there were to be asymmetry of information, then countries or governments may not impose the correct policy responses. So transparency and accurate information is actually necessary, not only at the country level, but also at the regional and at the international level. And I think Anabel stressed the importance of AMIS in that regard. Accurate information is beneficial for the operation of markets. In the WTO context, transparency relates mainly to the provision of timely information by WTO members on trade-related measures subject to WTO disciplines, as well as peer review in relevant committees, whether it's in the case of SPS committee or implementation-related issues in the case of the Agreement on Agriculture. As a result of COVID, the WTO implemented several additional actions so as to enhance transparency. We basically created a specific trade monitoring mechanism, and there was also the creation of a cross-divisional WTO COVID-19 task force. And their main task is to assemble and analyze COVID-19 related data and produce analytical papers which should help WTO members in their policy responses. The importance of transparency has also been stressed by WTO senior management, as well as by several members in several communications in recent months, notably in relation to export restrictions of food products. And I think Anabel made mention of several initiatives by Canada, Switzerland, Singapore, New Zealand, a number of countries, basically stressing the need, if countries were to impose export restrictions, they need to abide by WTO disciplines. WTO is also active in enhancing transparency-related activities through its participation in AMIS, which is led by the FAO and OECD, to share information and related analysis on levels of production, consumption, stocks, and food prices. Now, addressing the second question, which short-term policy measures can help minimize the negative impacts and manage the crisis? I think, as Anabel pointed out, following the outbreak of the COVID-19, many WTO members imposed export restrictions And the response was that a lot of countries believed that would damage the multilateral trading system. Countries wanted to avoid the mistakes which were made in 2007 and 2008. And as I said, mentioned a few moments ago, transparency is very key. So what we saw is that a number of members in various communications stressed the need that if governments were to impose emergency measures to protect human lives and preserve the health and safety, food security of their populations, they must conform to WTO disciplines, and they must be targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary, and shouldn't create unnecessary barriers to trade or cause disruptions to global food supply chains. International organizations such as the FAO, the World Food Programme, the World Bank, as well as regional organizations and bilateral development agencies, have also been very active in providing targeted advice and support to countries in need of assistance to deal with COVID. The WTO has been participating in some of these exports, notably in the SPS sector through its role in the Standards and Trade Development Facility, which, as Anabel mentioned, is housed in the WTO, specifically in the Agriculture and Commodities Division. Some members have also reacted by adopting trade facilitating measures, and that is very, very much welcome. A lot of countries have done that. In fact, we have many countries imposing trade facilitating measures than imposing trade restrictive measures. And I think the call of the WTO Director General and senior management, and also by the members themselves, a lot of countries have heeded that call and have rolled back all restrictive measures. So we find tariff reductions, streamlining border procedures, or relaxing labeling requirements to facilitate food supply during the crisis. Examples in the SPS field include accepting electronically SPS certificates, which obviously cuts time and actually facilitates trade. Over 20 countries, varying levels of development, have also adopted temporary reductions or granted duty exemptions to food products or other measures such as VAT exemption or postponement of duty payment. Following the success of some of these measures, it can be envisaged that some of them may be implemented by countries on a long-term basis. As mentioned above, one of the main perceived risks is the lack of access to food, and more precisely, healthy food by the poor and nutritionally vulnerable segments of the population, including school-age children. According to the FAO, more than 170 countries, both developed and developing, have planned, initiated, expanded, or adapted social assistance programs such as cash transfers, in-kind food aid, subsidized food distribution schemes, and school feeding to better respond to the social consequences, which are sometimes accompanied by increased stockpiling through increased imports or public stockholding programs. And here, I think a number of WTO members have also stressed that we should make sure that PSH programs do not actually distort trade or actually also cause food insecurity for other countries. So there are members who have warned that in dealing with COVID, if countries want to expand or introduce public stockholding programs, they need to ensure that these programs operate in accordance with the WTO rules in the Agreement on Agriculture. A few countries also adopted export restrictions or prohibitions, as Anabel mentioned. Around between 20 to 22 countries adopted such measures. And following the the concerns expressed, the good news is that most of these have been won back. And if you look at the IFPRI COVID-19 tracker, you see how a lot of countries have actually removed these measures. And as mentioned, this is mainly because of transparency, the flow of information, the assurance that food is not in short supply. And I think this has emboldened countries in doing so. So this is why transparency is very important. Now, obviously, following the first round of measures implemented by countries, many governments, including ACP countries, developed various measures to fix supply chains and support farmers, especially the most vulnerable ones. This included support to farmers' revenue. In fact, today I read in the Financial Times that US farmers will be handed $37 billion, which is obviously of concern to many WTO members. But as you can see, as a result of the crisis, obviously, if you look at WTO, the US entitlements will be 19.1 billion. Obviously, if these are green box measures, then there is no limit. But you can see the amounts which are being provided by government to support their farmers. And some of them have taken the form of direct subsidies and grants, debt and tax postponing or relief, easier access to credit, including lower interest rates, new lending schemes, or the extension of public guarantees to back loans. Some programs address directly the fall in prices or demand through additional storage aid, public stockholding, purchase of surplus commodities for domestic food aid distribution, or through direct financial compensation of price losses. Some measures reduce the cost of farming activities, such as reducing the cost of facilitating access to raw materials and inputs. Others aimed at upgrading farming facilities and supply chain infrastructures, including supporting the introduction of health and safety measures to reduce health-related risk along segments of the food supply chain to reinforce the resilience of the food supply chain vis-a-vis COVID-19 related health risks. We have also seen that COVID has presented an opportunity to develop new digital tools to provide more effectively services such as crop insurance, extension services, banking services, market information, notably through e-commerce, while reducing physical interaction. And I think this is how trade is important. Obviously, in the WTO, we are trying very hard to get an agreement on e-commerce. Regrettably, it is a plurilateral initiative, not multilateral, but I think there is a push that the outcomes, if members are able to reach agreement, it will be extended on an MFN basis and there would be open accession. So countries which are not participating now can later on, at the time of their own, can accede to any agreement which may be reached. There were also various measures put in place to compensate increased air freight, other logistical costs. And basically, whereas the WTO supports more these measures, the question has been asked whether we need also to look at the trade and production distorting effects of some of these measures, the possible negative impact they could have on other members, and the consistency of some of these measures with WTO disciplines. As is well known, WTO disciplines favor measures with no or at most minimally trade distorting effects, or if from production covered by the so-called green box, such as general services, decoupled income support, and public stockholding for food security purposes with food purchases made at market prices. Now, turning to what reforms can be implemented to improve access to food in the medium term. Obviously, there are a number of measures, and I think Anabel covered most of these. What we need, and I think this is a problem, that we need to have a vibrant and a dynamic agricultural sector, which will be capable of ensuring stable access over time to safe, healthy, nutritious, and more diversified food for an increasing world population, which is estimated to increase to between 9 and 10 billion by 2050, while at the same time using natural resources more sustainably and making an effective contribution to climate change adaptation and mitigation. The current COVID crisis may lead to a reorganization of food supply chains, resulting from a different appreciation of the perceived risks, including attempts to develop shorter supply chains and a diversification of the sources of supply. Nevertheless, I think it cannot be doubted that an open, predictable, transparent, inclusive, and less distorted international trading system will continue to constitute a critical and indispensable component of a comprehensive strategy to ensure food security for all. In that context, and I think Anabel also underlined the point, that it is important for WTO members to make progress in agricultural negotiations. Currently, I think apart from the negotiations on fishery subsidies, you could say that the one active negotiations is the agricultural negotiations. And we do have 7 topics under the agricultural negotiations. We do have domestic support, market access, export competition, export restrictions, public stockholding, special safeguard mechanism, and cotton. And while the COVID crisis has focused renewed attention by some members naturally on issues such as export restrictions and food security, as well as support granted to farmers, because there is the concern that some countries may have exceeded their WTO entitlement. So obviously there is the concern by several members. The issues and objectives in the negotiations appear not to have changed significantly. Rather, the current crisis and ensuing policy responses have highlighted once more the need for WTO members to press ahead with the negotiations to come up with a balanced agreement which will contribute to the food security of each and every country. From a process point of view, some of you may be aware that we do have a new chair, Ambassador Gloria Abraham Peralta of Costa Rica, who took over from the former chair, DeFord of Guyana. And the new chair has already started consultations, and she has basically asked members their views on 3 critical issues: what lessons have been learned from the negotiating process, their priorities in the negotiations in light of COVID, and the process towards the next ministerial conference, which is tentatively scheduled to take place in June 2021 in Kazakhstan. It is the expectation of members that the ministerial meeting in Kazakhstan, MC12, will produce a roadmap which will guide members to reach a substantive outcome in agriculture by MC13, which will contribute to food security in terms of leveling the playing field, increasing production more sustainably, and ensuring that we have a resilient agricultural sector. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edwini. Thank you very much, Anabel. For these 2 interventions that are very, very relevant and very much focused. So I really appreciate your clarity in both describing the current situation and analyzing the challenge and its implications. I also appreciate how well targeted and applicable are your policy recommendations. So moving to the questions and the Q&A section, let's start by one aspect that has been evident throughout the presentation, which is about the role of local supply chains. One of the conclusions of this current crisis is that shorter supply chains seem to be more resilient in comparison to the global lengthy value chains, which sometimes can involve several companies, which are thousands of kilometers apart. Is this the moment to prioritize these shorter supply chains? And if so, is that a sustainable scenario? What if it is indeed a response, what policies could promote this?
So maybe say a couple of words here, and then of course see if Winnie would like to come in. I believe that there is a very important role to play for local supply chains, but also for regional and global supply chains. And let me explain myself. I think local supply chains in the case of products where countries have comparative advantage. It makes a lot of sense. And for this to work, it's important that, as we were discussing before, that agriculture is considered an essential activity, that workers are protected and taken care of in these particular industries, and that domestic constraints to domestic commerce are reduced. We know that a lot of the food, for instance, in African countries is in markets, but increasingly as populations have moved to urban centers, they cannot grow their food. They need to go to markets and buy food. So keeping in place, open logistics, making sure that transportation works well. In a lot of countries, for example, and this is something, it's in many countries in Africa, it's the same in Latin America, for that matter, there are a number of restrictions on transportation. And these restrictions, there are a lot, competition issues, monopolies and the like, and this increases the cost of moving goods across the country. Having said that, there is no one country that can or should produce, everything that consumes, simply because the price would be, impossible for the consumer, or the agronomic conditions are not there, or many other reasons. So countries need to import in order to be able to strengthen their food security. And I want to make the case here in particular for regional trade across Africa, because it's being said that if Africa could defragment the continent, if the borders could be less thick, then there will be an opportunity for Africa to feed Africa, because given the different conditions, of course, some products are grown in some regions, some products are grown in other regions. The problem, however, so far is that still, despite the progress that has been made in a number of regions, for instance, in East Africa, the reality is that there are a lot of non-tariff barriers that even, while there is integration across some of the sub-regions, or within some of the sub-regions, there is not enough integration across sub-regions. So we still have tariffs, we still have non-tariff barriers, we still have this high transportation and logistics costs that I was mentioning. So the reality is that the potential for regional integration to strengthen food systems in Africa is not fully leveraged because of these obstacles. And this is where I think that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement could play a significant role, but only if it does not exclude agricultural products, if it has simple rules of origin, if it also works on trade facilitation, because I think the key here, the key words are, trade cost reduction. This is very important, and this applies not only to the final goods, but also to inputs. Access to, timely access to low-cost inputs is absolutely essential to, be able to produce what's needed. So yes to local supply chains, but also think about regional supply chains. And more broadly, there are places in Africa that will need to continue to import wheat or import maize, import rice. So looking at global supply chains is also critical.
Thank you. Just before moving to Edwini, to complement this question, I have some reactions from our participants. For example, Roberto asked about this local food chains. Would it make sense to rethink and redesign partially the food global value chain to be more locally centered? Would this improve future food security and sustainability issues? And also a question from participant Thomas. What about using this opportunity, this situation as an opportunity to push for food import substitution? by pushing local production, such as local milk as compared to imported milk powder?
These are very good questions, quite frankly. Just a brief comment in the sense that I think there are many, there is, I guess, a case for thinking about domestic production of some commodities. But it's also important to make sure that there is alignment with comparative advantages. So, you know, in some places, you will never be able to produce wheat. It simply doesn't make any sense. For others, and dairy is a good example, that may be, you know, that may be the case. But I think it's important to think about, you know, how is it that trade could support dairy production? And it's not through high tariffs. Because then remember that we're talking here also about consumers that are being impacted in you know, in their disposable incomes with the disacceleration of economic activity. So you want to make sure you don't want to have the consumer paying extraordinarily high prices to develop a sector that does not have comparative advantage. And this is something that I think is very important. Now you can improve the competitiveness of a particular sector as well using trade. For instance, reducing or eliminating access tariffs on inputs, for example, feed, fertilizer, herbicides, and others. And the other point that I think is relevant to make is that of the regional value chains. I do think that there is room for further development of regional value chains in the region, but again, trade costs need to come down for that to happen.
Okay, thank you very much. On the question, I would like to stress that the three are not mutually exclusive, whether local, regional, or global supply chains. Obviously, the WTO rules are quite neutral, but as Anabel said, it is countries have different endowments. The cost of production may be different. So obviously, I think the reason why there have been calls for shorter supply chains as a result of this pandemic, also one could be the imposition of export restrictions by countries where countries felt that, you know, if our supplies cannot be guaranteed, then why don't we turn inward? So I think we need to put everything into perspective, but I wouldn't say that it gives us the opportunity to basically turn inward. The three, as I said, are not mutually exclusive. If a country can produce cheaply and more sustainably, because it may not make sense, we need also to be very mindful of the environment. If some country can produce more sustainably and a country cannot, then from an environmental perspective, we do not need to use more resources, finite resources, to produce something which can be imported at a fraction of the cost. So I think we need to see things in a much more coordinated and a broader framework. But I wouldn't say that the crisis has really, we just need to learn the lessons. Why? Because obviously, if a country was dependent on imports and the imports were cut off, then obviously that country will feel concerned that, well, look, I can no longer trust the international trading system. So we need to make sure that we strengthen the multilateral trading system. We need to learn the lessons from this crisis. As we say, no one should waste a crisis. We need to learn the lessons. We need to have a much more resilient trading system, which would allay the concerns. But generally speaking, I think the three can work hand in hand, and we shouldn't prioritize. So that's what I'll say to this question.
Thank you. So yes, absolutely, multilateralism is still the answer, as well as deepening regional integration and regional chains. So now that I have Edwini, just continuing with you, a question for you. You mentioned the importance of interconnectedness of countries This, of course, can be easier and faster and more actionable for continental countries. From your experience and knowledge of the Pacific region, what measures would you recommend for small islands?
Well, it's a very difficult question. Even in the Pacific, they are separated by thousands of miles, because so the Pacific actually faces unique challenges. I mean, even if you compare with, let's say, the Caribbean. So clearly, I think in the Pacific, one of the things is we need to make regional integration work, and the Pacific Island countries have taken a decisive step towards, concluding the PESA Plus agreement, which will link their economies with that of Australia and New Zealand. The Pacific Island countries would also need more assistance. They need to have targeted assistance to develop the agriculture. Very few countries produce very few products. Most of them are net food importing countries. They rely on food from Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. So I think if we were to have deeper integration, and as I said, they have taken the step in that right direction through the PESA Plus agreement, which is not yet effective, but I think it should come into force very soon. And accompanied that, I think Australia and New Zealand have also undertaken to provide them with adequate assistance to develop, not only the agricultural services sector, but to help the countries to develop the productive capacity. But clearly, given that the countries, the islands are very small, the cost of production very high, energy costs are very high, it would make sense for them to cooperate. And this is where regional value chains would be very important. Clearly, Australia and New Zealand being the two neighboring countries and being two countries which are powerhouses in agriculture, having an agreement linking these countries and providing the Pacific countries with the necessary support would help enhance their food security. So this is a classic case where I think that regional value chains can actually be a win-win, both for Australia and New Zealand and for the island countries as well.
Thank you. Anabel, you mentioned that, of course, and you reiterated it recently in the previous question, that regional trade is critical for food security. The current crisis can actually lead to new opportunities, as we have seen in your presentation, to find and implement new approaches to guarantee food security. What can be done at a Pan-African level or at a sub-regional level to improve these supply chains probably through more effective regional regulatory frameworks, or what policies or measures can be taken at the regional level? What can be, for example, harmonized, or where the efforts should focus?
Let me maybe make reference to 3 points, because that's an important question. The first one relates to regulatory frameworks and streamlining, on the one hand, the non-tariff measures that may be in place, be it SPS measures or technical measures or other measures. And then related to that, facilitating compliance with those measures, either through harmonization efforts or mutual recognition of those measures across countries. In some areas, as you were suggesting, sub-regional, for instance, regulatory frameworks may also help. So the first point relates to the non-tariff measures. The second point, which I think is quite interesting, is thinking through the role of digital platforms in integrating markets in the region. And I brought this example of Twiga Foods because this is an entrepreneur who, I think he worked for many years for Coca-Cola. And then a few years ago, he decided to start his company, basically bringing together suppliers, producers, and consumers by collecting fruits and vegetables, as I was saying, from some 35,000 producers, and bringing them to to markets, to retail, and it's been a very successful example of reducing trade costs in Kenya, giving access to consumers to products that is fresh, giving certainty to producers on the prices, eliminating middlemen which may take advantage of the lack of information that producers may have. So these digital platforms are I think a very interesting example of how how countries could also put in place the environments, the sort of regulatory environment that is conducive to the development of this type of enterprises. And the third element, which I think relates very much to this, is trade facilitation, because this is an agenda that, although there has been important progress, there is still more that needs to be done. And here we know that the trade facilitation agreement provides a framework, also as it provides a framework in terms of a regulatory framework, but importantly, also countries have to establish national committees to bring in together the different agencies that participate at the border. And this can be a very powerful instrument to also, foster trade cost reduction and further integrate markets in the region. So, I don't think there is one magic bullet that will make it happen, but I do think that actions in all of these different areas can go a long way in terms of bringing down the reduction, reducing costs. And this is something, in thinking about the medium term, the long term, you want to have agricultural and food systems that are, that are efficient, where, goods can move from surplus regions to regions where it is needed in a much more seamless way. And this of the managing non-tariff measures in a more efficient way, looking at the opportunities of digital trade and fully implementing trade facilitation measures, I think can, as I said, can go in that direction.
Thank you. Just to echoing on your point about the digital tools, Anabel. Obviously, a tool like Twiga Foods, or requires a very good coordination between the public and the private sector. What role could policymakers play to actually enable these digital tools to succeed?
Well, I think one important element of it is the public-private dialogue, because in some of these areas, these are innovative frameworks, and it's important for policymakers to understand what are the needs in terms of policies from the private sector. So maybe it's a legislation that relates to digital payments, for example. That may be something that's of importance to them, or it may relate to digital signatures, or there are many dimensions of this that could be important. And here, I think again, there's a national dimension, which is each country and its own national framework to govern, for example, digital trade. There's a regional dimension, and this is something that when the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, for example, was started to be discussed, it was not part of the plan. But then, fortunately, ministers came and said we will make this a priority because this has great potential for Africa. And finally, we also know that there are negotiations taking place in the Joint Strategic Initiative in the context of the WTO, where a number of members, which I think now, I don't remember the exact number, but I think they now are about 100 members of the WTO who are engaged in the negotiations on e-commerce. So again, the domestic, the regional, the global level can come together in supporting a conducive policy environment for entrepreneurs to develop these platforms. And some African countries have some great, actually, we think about Kenya, great examples. We all know the famous case of M-Pesa, about mobile payments, and in a way that has been an enabler as well for this business models like that implemented by Twiga. So I see great potential for this in Africa for strengthening the food systems in the region.
Thank you very much. Edwini?
Hi.
Yes, I would be interested to hear your views as well on this, how to enable these digital tools, and also from your WTO perspective, more global perspective, is this a tool that could be a good complement to the traditional ways of connecting buyers and sellers or trading in agriculture?
Definitely, yes. I think I do agree with what Anabel said, and I think it's very, very important. I mean, especially for the examples of in many African countries where through mobile platforms you find women in particular are able to sell their products directly to their consumers, cutting off middlemen who usually take most of the profit. So obviously having that tool would actually help increase production, because if they find a ready market and can earn more profits which they can reinvest, then it will let the businesses grow. From a WTO perspective, I think it's very important for us to press ahead. And I think that has been one of the main criticisms of the WTO, that the WTO rule book has not kept pace with developments in the global economy. We need to have an agreement on e-commerce, although we do have here and there, but they are not coherent. And this is why the e-commerce, but as I had mentioned, it is a plurilateral agreement. And the idea would be that if we were to get an agreement, of course, there are many issues which have to be resolved in terms of, data protection. How do you, prevent fraud? Systems of payment. There are many other issues which have, but I think they are making good progress in the negotiations. And once an agreement is reached, hopefully it will be adopted by all the members, and obviously each country would have to take into account their national and regional. But certainly having an agreement on e-commerce would be of benefit to all countries, particularly developing countries, whether they want to trade internally, regionally, or internationally. So I think there's a lot to be done, and I think WTO members realize that. And from an agricultural point of view, I was in China 2 years ago, and we had, in fact, the minister, the vice minister then is now the current FAO Director General, and he showed myself and my boss Alan Wolf how China has developed in terms of e-commerce in agriculture. You may be in one province, you can order something, but these are the logistical tools, because in China, they had Alibaba and others with the logistical. So in many African countries where this may not exist, it could be a problem considering the perishable nature of some agricultural products. So clearly, if this has to take off in Africa, then there are other issues which would need to be addressed, in terms of logistics, because logistics is very important. If you have to have e-commerce in agricultural products, it's very different from industrial products owing to the perishable nature. So we need to have that framework in place, or have give deeper thought to how this would happen, and especially with the ASFTA, if it has to work. If I'm from Ghana and I want to order something from South Africa, what would be the delivery time? All of this would provide opportunities, but it obviously also requires a lot of thinking and investment. And once that is done, I think it would help boost agricultural production and trade on the continent. And not only that, but also all over the world. If we have e-commerce working and there are guarantees, I'm sure that it would actually help increase trade in agricultural products worldwide.
Thank you, Edwini. This is a very relevant point and a very interesting view, and a very positive view for us to to kind of start concluding this session, just with that positive view, because we see enormous opportunities in digital tools, in e-commerce, kind of eliminating the middleman and so on, connecting buyers and sellers. We see enormous opportunities for the mitigation of the current crisis and future crises. So you both have talked about these opportunities. Anabel mentioned, if I remember well, that policymakers have learned from previous crises. Edwini said very, very clearly, don't waste a good crisis. So just to conclude, I'd like to get your views on what lessons should we have from this current food supply crisis that could be applicable to the next ones, because unfortunately there will be more, and particularly the next ones related to climate change. Anabel or Edwini?
Anabel, you want to go first?
Just quickly to say, I would say monitor, monitor, monitor. I think this is something very relevant that applies to food crisis. It also applies to climate-related crisis. Second one is be ready to act swiftly. And the third one is, use the power of trade to mitigate or manage the crisis. That would, of course, depend on the nature of the crisis itself. But it is important that trade can be part of the solution, and it must be leveraged as such. Thank you.
Thank you. Edwini?
Thank you, Diego. For me, I think one lesson which has to be drawn is the need for transparency. I did mention, and Anabel also mentioned, the reason why a lot of countries imposed export restrictions was mainly because of insufficient information. So I think WTO members should use this opportunity to notify their measures. If they notify we have, or there is no asymmetry of information through AMIS and others. If countries know that stocks are plentiful, then they wouldn't impose export restrictions. So that is one thing. And also we need to press ahead with the negotiations. For example, one of the issues we are looking at in the context of the negotiations is that in the context of agriculture negotiations, that if a country wants to impose export restrictions, it needs to give at least 30 days advance notice where possible. Now, what we find is that a number of countries didn't do that. Although, as I said, this is not yet, it's one of the issues we are looking at. But assuming we were to have a rule at the WTO, which provides that countries should give adequate notice, then it would give opportunities for food importing countries to source food elsewhere. So it is very important for us to also press ahead with the negotiations. We have also seen that as a result of this crisis, countries have been providing a lot of subsidies. Are these subsidies really trade? Do they distort trade and production? So we need also to move ahead to have tighter rules, which would ensure that in future crises, countries will not be able to do that, because that could have serious ramifications. So I think we need to have more transparency, and we need to press ahead. The negotiations have been dragging on for far too long, and if we had effective rules, then some of the crisis that we are facing could have been avoided. So I think that two key lessons that I think WTO members should learn from this crisis and make sure that we don't waste this crisis.
Thank you, Edwini and Anabel. So just to wrap up, tighter rules and more efficient rules, transparency to avoid these asymmetries of information. Don't underestimate the power of trade. Monitor, as Anabel said, and react quickly. Thank you so much for this very good conclusion. So just moving ahead with the presentation, if our colleague can help us with that, excellent. We have this last slide. first, I want to thank our panelists today. It has been an excellent presentation, excellent exchange. I'm pretty sure that our participants were really interested in what you said and your recommendations. So thank you so much on behalf of the ICR facility, our donors, and the implementing agencies. Thank you very much. So as a follow-up to this seminar, we offer to ACP countries, to policymakers in ACP countries, the possibility to have a one-on-one session with the experts involved in the webinars. In this case, Anabel González. So with this one-on-one clinics, we look for some possibilities to follow up on some questions that you still have about this, or more importantly, how can you discuss with the expert how to adapt these recommendations to your specific case, to your specific challenges. This is something that we are offering as a follow-up to eligible participants from ACP countries. This can be from a public or private organization based in an ACP country, any of the 79 countries of the ACP. Of course, for this, you may send us an email expressing this request no later than the 10th of September. So you can send us an email exposing your case, the questions you would like to tackle, and how this could be useful for your specific country. So thank you very much. I think here we conclude our session today. Thank you very much again to our panelists, Edwini and Anabel. Thank you for your time and your knowledge. And again, thanks again to all our participants from so many different regions.